Thanks for joining us. This is our extended interview with Mike Whelan. The first part of this video is from our GNGF Live that happens every other Wednesday. The second part here, though, is the bonus extended interview where we dive into more details around some of the great concepts from his upcoming book, Lawyer Forward. If you already saw the live, I'll put the timestamp to the exclusive extended interview below. Now be sure to like and subscribe to follow along with all of our great conversations on legal marketing and the business side of running a law firm. And if you want to watch this on any video platform of your choice, you can find everywhere we stream at gngf.tv. Are you a solo or small firm lawyer? Do you sometimes feel stuck because you're pulled between all the day-to-day demands of running a law firm business and the billable hours you need to survive, while somewhere in there you're just trying to help out your clients? Well, today on GNGF Live, we are talking with Mike Whelan, former solo lawyer and author of Lawyer Forward, to help you get unstuck and find your place in the future of law. Welcome to GNGF Live, your bi-weekly Ask the Experts about all things law firm marketing and business growth. I'm Mark Homer, author of Online Law Practice Strategies and founder of Get Noticed, Get Found. Okay, where are we going to be speaking next? Well, if you missed us in San Diego at ClioCon or at that small firm technology bootcamp we had in Minneapolis, then next up on December 6th, I'm going to be speaking at a CLE at the Omaha Bar Association. And during the week of December 15th through 20th, we're speaking at the Law Firm Growth Virtual Summit. This place is one, it's an online, you can join thousands of small and solo law firms across the country. It's a web-based summit, so no need to travel. You can jump in and out on the topics that matter to you. I don't have a link yet, but I'll add that to the comments when the website goes live. It's going to be awesome. And finally, GNGF is proud to be joining 4 other great legal marketing agencies to put on the second Best Damn Legal Marketing Conference, or Bedlam 2020. It's going to be in Las Vegas, April 1st through 3rd. And depending on when you're watching this, early bird pricing might still be available, so use that code EARLYBIRD2020 to save $200. And that's at bedlamconference.com. Okay, let me welcome Mike Whelan to GNGF Live. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, good to see you again, Mark.
Always good to see you. So thank you for the early copy of Lawyer Forward. I devoured it last week. It was very interesting. I mean, we've been talking about a lot of this. I've been following you on Twitter, so a lot of things in there weren't totally new to me. But for the people watching, tell me about what you call like the churn of being a solo or small firm lawyer.
Yeah, so very briefly, when I originally wrote this book, I have a logistics background pre-law. And so I was trying to write a book about the legal supply chain, which is just systems thinking applied to law. It was super boring. It was a how-to. It was boring. So I decided to go back and kind of add my personal narrative and my personal story. And the day that it starts, there's this day that probably seems pretty common to lawyers, where I was just running around and I was doing all the things. I was in a rural area, and so I had a general practice. I was running to 5 different counties. It was just a mess. And I went through this day and I realized at the end of the day that I was just miserable. I had done what I was supposed to do. It was a very busy day. It was a very productive day. But there was a senior lawyer that I saw there that really shocked me. He was an 80-year-old man, and he was practicing, and he was just on autopilot. And I knew him well enough to know he didn't want to still be practicing. This wasn't a guy who was trying to keep his mind active or something. He really didn't have a business that had value that was providing for him into his old age. And he was in this churn, this idea that you just turn the next hour and you turn the next paper and you turn the next client, and that's where your value comes from. And so seeing this man really set me off on a mission for myself to find an alternative, and then frames kind of the narrative backdrop of this book of me discovering a better alternative to what I call the churn.
Yeah, and I like how you broke it down into like silos, stagnation, distrust, and tradition as kind of like how people are stuck in that churn, and what you actually use some of that going forward in the book about what to change. The other thing I liked is you had an analogy from was it Young Me Moon on that if a space alien wants to buy a box of cereal, they come down and they look at the cereal aisle with no context, like no history of what different things mean on cereal. Their only choice is to grab a random box off the shelf. And working with a lot of law firms and from a marketing standpoint, trying to differentiate, and I totally got that. That made a lot of sense to me, that honestly a lot of consumers, that's where they're stuck, right? They're just pulling a lawyer off the shelf.
Right. And for the lawyer, I mean, if you know anything about, like I said, I worked in logistics. If you know anything about shelves, if you go to a grocery store, the different shelves cost different amounts of money for placement for the given company that's trying to place the cereal box in front of the eye, because they know that for most people, it really is like a space alien pulling a random cereal box off of a shelf. And so they pay for that visibility on whatever level is right at your eye, or they pay for the end cap, or they pay for prime placement so that people who don't know the difference can see them. And as you well know, there are a lot of lawyers who are paying for visibility because they don't know how to do something better. And that book, Young May Moon's book, is called Different. And her argument is basically that if you want to train the space alien, right? Most legal consumers are not experienced legal buyers. They're really coming in with no context. If you want to train that person on your value and the permanence of your value, you can't just be a random, easily replaced thing on the shelf. And throughout the book, I talk about this cost of replacement, like the availability of substitutes is what economists call it. And the more that you can be easily substituted, and it doesn't mean substituted with a better alternative even. Sometimes you're substituted with a just okay alternative. As long as there is a substitute for you, you have lower economic value. And that's the rut that I see a lot of lawyers in. They are easily substituted, and we are being substituted.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the things that drives up all those prices. Like, AdWords is legal is one of the most expensive industries, because without differentiating yourself, that's really all you're got, is to try to be that top cereal box on the shelf right at eye level, right? It just pay more money for ads. So what does a lawyer do to stand out?
Well, yeah, and you mentioned the cost of being, top of mind. Part of it is that we've made so much money, right? I talked to TC Whitaker at PwC, the accounting firm, and he said something to me that kind of shocked me. He said, problem with the lawyers is that they've just made too much money. And because our margins are so high, we tend to not do the activities that make it so we stand out. So to get into kind of the meat of the book a little bit, one of the things that drives me crazy that you and I have talked about is the idea that every solo lawyer is an entrepreneur, or that every solo lawyer is an expert, right? So we use these terms, and I go to legal conferences, and literally every time I go to Clio, for example, which is a conference I love, you and I were both there, both phrases were used, that all lawyers are experts and all lawyers are entrepreneurs. And to kind of frame how absurd that is, think of the case. There's a case, you wouldn't know this because why would you know this, but this will resonate to your lawyer crowd. There's a case called Dobert. Some pronounce it Daubert, and some get really fancy and call it Daubert because they are French, and I guess that's cooler. But it's actually Dobert, which is the coolest possible option. Dobert. Anyway,
Dobert.
the Dobert case, it had to do with expert witnesses, right? In a case, you've got the fact witnesses who say, I saw the building burn, and you've got the expert witnesses who say, oh, it was susceptible to burning because of the construction, and here's the problem. When you have expert witnesses in cases, theoretically, anybody, any Yahoo could show up and say, I'm an expert. And it's the other side's job to undermine the expert in testimony. It's really inefficient. And when you put a fake expert up on the stand, it gives this look to a jury like they're experts. So courts decided they were trying to figure out, what's our filter responsibility? How should we filter out the Yahoos, right? And it was called the general acceptance rule. If they said something that was generally accepted in the scientific community that they're part of, then cool, we're going to let them go up and testify to that. What Dobert does is it created a new rule that was based on the method, right? So it wasn't, are they called doctor? It was, do they use the scientific method to arrive at their result, at their claim? And if they do, then we can trust that expert, right? It's a distinction between credentials and method. And so what I advocate for in the book is figuring out, if you want to claim to be an expert, great. We need that. We need expertise. Genuine expertise is vital, but your degree has roughly nothing to do with it for the legal consumer. What they care about is the good that's delivered to them, and that's defined by the method that you bring. Do you bring the expert's method? Or if you want to be the entrepreneurial type, audience focused, service focused, which is great, follow the method. the problem that I think we have in law, and it's encouraged by this churn model of practice, is that we claim to be both while really being neither. And largely it's because we're told to be both at the same time. So what I advocate for is picking one of those two and following the method.
Yeah, I mean, you spend a lot of time in your book kind of explaining that you can't be both an expert and an entrepreneur, and why there's a natural conflict there. That was, I think, eye-opening a little bit. I mean, we talked about it before, but like the detail you go in with how and why that is, it can conflicts, was very interesting. So to take it to the next step though, so let's say someone reads a book and they're like, okay, I get it. I'm either expert or access, right? I'm focusing on audience and maybe solutions, or I'm focusing on deep expertise. So if someone wants to be known as an expert, what would they do?
Right. So there's a really great book on this called The Business of Expertise by David Baker. And I really like his method. He calls it getting to know, KNOW.
Mhm.
And basically he says, if you decide that you want to be an expert in a certain area, he obsesses over positioning. And positioning is about narrowing in on the problem that you want to obsess over. Typically, solopreneurs, they focus on an audience, right? This
Mhm.
is what Baker calls a vertical positioning. You're focusing on a kind of person, right? And whatever problem they're running into, you're a solutions engine. You're trying to create the solution for them. An expert is a horizontal positioning. They care about a problem. They don't care about the context in which the problem arises, but they're obsessing over the problem. So Baker says, first start with positioning. And then you use case studies, right? You're going through and figuring out what are the truths that I can pull out of repeated experiences, right? And once you have that pattern matching, that pattern recognition, you pull insights from it. So the getting to know process is saying, all right, I decide that I want to be the expert in livestock as property. I want to be the cow lawyer, right? Which I
Yep.
talk about in the book.
Yep. Cow lawyer in the book.
If you super want to be the cow guy, then you really hone in on that issue. And you would get down to a piece of paper and you would say, I want to be the cow guy. I'm not the cow guy right now. I'm a faker. What would a genuine cow guy expert know? What would they have a strong, informed opinion on? And what Baker says is write that down and then put next to it a content medium that you'll use to arrive at that opinion. So, for example, you say, I really want to have an expert in cow stuff would have a strong opinion about inheritance laws dealing with living things, whatever. I have no idea. But say that's a thing that you want to really care about.
Hmm.
Well, then you just put a date on it and you say, I'm going to give a talk at a CLE conference on inheriting cows, right?
Right.
And you write the 3,000 words that you have to have a strong informed opinion. The content exercise forces you to create a strong opinion on it. And then what experts do in the scientific method is that they then put that out for criticism before the talk even.
A
Put it
peer
out for
review.
criticism. Right, the peer review process. You put it out there and you just take the criticism as it is and you hone your opinion. You strengthen that opinion. By the time you sit down or you stand up and you give that talk about inheriting cows, you will have an informed opinion that is strengthened by peer review, by revision, by editing, so that you're not just pulling stuff out of your wherever, which is what most of us do as solo and small practitioners. A lot of times, somebody would come in with something I don't know, and I would say, okay, let me go review this, right? I would go
Right.
research it. And it was basically, I would buy a book from the ABA for $200 for 50 pages. I would read a quarter of it. And then I would say, yep, I'm good now. And I would give some really baseless, uninformed opinion. And honestly, I've debated this with ethics lawyers. I think that probably satisfies ethics requirements for you to go get that book and to read however much of it and say, this is what I think is true. You could probably get yourself out of trouble. That's not the method, right? The expert method is the scientific process.
Right. And you talk about how the monopoly nature that, I mean, obviously is breaking down and changing a lot. But the fact that, like for a while, like lawyers were the only ones who had access to this body of knowledge. And that was enough, to your point in the ethics rules, to say you provided the right guidance because you read a couple of chapters that nobody else could read.
Right.
Right. So that was interesting, but it aligned with, we always talk about, and we've been talking about it for probably the last few months on our Facebook Lives too, about the wasted time spent blogging by a lot of lawyers. Now, if you're an expert, we always talk about if you're passionate on a topic, if you're out there on Twitter debating this and you're putting content out there, that's a great reason to blog, right? Like
Right.
that's the case studies, the blogs, the getting comments on Twitter back and forth, having panel discussions. That's like the expert side. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
Right. Yeah. The time wasting thing is just a fascinating thing. One of the things I talk about in the book is the first Clio Legal Trends report, where they freaked everybody out by saying lawyers are only billing 2 hours a day.
Mhm.
And as I kind of thought through that, and even at the time, my gut reaction was, well, that's a useless piece of information, because really a lawyer should either be billing something approaching zero because they're the entrepreneurial type. To use a Seth Godinism, entrepreneurs make decisions while freelancers, in this
Do the
case,
work. Yeah.
freelance experts, make stuff, right? So if you're making decisions, your billable hours should be close to zero. And so the definition of your waste of time is really different than it is for an expert attorney whose billable hour, I mean, I think the billable hour is a terrible measurement of value, but theoretically, you should be spending more time doing the kind of activities that you're talking about, right? Like you're developing that expertise through content, those informed opinions, standing out there and being subject to peer review. That we make fun of legal journals because nobody reads them, but the truth is the other legal scholars read them, and they come back to those legal scholars and they say,
Right.
here's where you were wrong on this or that. What I would encourage somebody to do who wants to be an expert is to think of your business less like a legal services firm and more like a consulting firm, right? Where
Right.
the wisdom, the knowledge, the pattern recognition, and the insights that come from those patterns, that's where the value lies, not in the delivery of monopolized legal services.
Right. So the other thing about that billable hour, I mean, it's so directionally, there were some things in the study I thought were interesting on the billable hour model, right? So we can point to a lot of things that there are, like you talked about outsourcing as something you probably should be doing, and you should be heading towards
Sure.
zero, which I'd like to, and not as an expert, but in that access running an entrepreneur model. But as an expert, the other thing is like if you can work or bill less, again, billable may not be the right, billable hour may not be right, but you should be able to charge more because you're providing the expert value,
Right.
right? Like something nobody else can provide. Nobody else has submitted these reviews, talked about this, been back and forth about it, and researched it to the level of depth you have. That's an expert, right?
Right.
So what's the other side? So you talk about like access, focus on the audience and the service and solutions.
Right. Yeah. The other side is the entrepreneur, right? And again, as Seth Godin said, the entrepreneur is making decisions. This is something that really, I'm probably alone in having a freak out about this. I had a whole Twitter rant about this the other day. When we use the word entrepreneur to apply to everyone with a business, it becomes so vague that it's not instructive. I heard a podcast the other day where somebody said, well, we're all entrepreneurs now because everybody's driving for Uber. And I'm sorry, if your definition is so wide that it includes both an Uber driver and Mark Zuckerberg, why do we even have that word? It's not very helpful, right? It doesn't
Right.
tell me what to do. It doesn't tell me what the method is. And so,
You
I,
introduced the word like expert freelancer or
right.
freelancer versus entrepreneur, like to separate that, right?
Right. Yeah. And again, that comes from this conversation between Brian Clark and Seth Godin, and this idea that if you're an expert freelancer, what that means is your craft is the value that you're delivering, right? Your brain, your method, your process. It's much harder to sell that kind of business. It can be done, and I talk in ways in the book on how you can scale that. But it's much more difficult than the entrepreneurial business where you're making decisions. It's more about hiring people and scaling and creating systems. The thing that's unique, I think, in our context for the entrepreneurial lawyer is that the entrepreneur is willing to deliver good enough law, right? As long as it's ethically compliant, right? The solopreneur has the ability and even the imperative to deliver something that's good enough to the user. For the expert to do that, to say, oh, you guys want this really accessible service, I'm going to deliver that to you, would undermine the entire brand value. So I give the distinction in the book between McDonald's and Gordon Ramsay's restaurant called
Right.
Burger, right? Gordon Ramsay's burger is like $50. McDonald's burger is like $5. The experience is totally different. McDonald's is service oriented. It's there for everybody. It's really easy to get in and out of. They watch your freaking kids practically, right? That's why we love it. You put your kids behind the glass and you don't have to parent for 30 minutes. It's awesome. Gordon Ramsay's burger is not that way. You have long lines, you have reservations, you pay a lot, you get that snotty lawyer who says words like Daubert, right? They're obnoxious. But because the craft is so good, you're willing to put up with that. And so for the solopreneur, thinking more like a McDonald's seems freaky, seems scary, because we have this we're experts thing, which is not informed by facts. But really, that's what consumers need. They need people who will be solutions engines, people who will come up with ways that say, okay, audience that I care about, you told me you have this particular problem. Now I'm going to use some design thinking principles to see if I can come up with a solution for it. If I can make that solution profitable, how do I source that? How do I have quality control? It's all business decision oriented, figuring out what you're going to deliver and how. And again, I put this person in a particular spot because I consider them the connector between the experts, right? So they have a particularly important role in the
Right.
delivery of expert services.
And providing that information and that understanding of all the different cereal boxes and what they mean, right? Like that's
Right.
what to me, the audience access person does. It says, well, here's how you categorize these in your mind. You know, like this is the type of service you need, consumer, and this is the type of service you need. Or here's the differences between those so you can choose, right? Like, do I choose the cheeseburger or the chicken sandwich at McDonald's? Like
Yeah.
they need to categorize
And
it for me.
to get nerdy about it, this is all systems thinking, but brought down to law practice. Most, really every complex system works as connected nodes of expertise, right? There's this one computer that does the one thing, and then it networks to the other computer that does the other thing. And it is the networking and the focus that allows this really high computing power, right? Transportation systems work this way. All logistics, it's these complex systems. Our brains work this way, that you have this segmentation, but you can't just have segmentation, you have to have connection. The issue that I see in law is that we're trying to behave as if we are sets of things, right? In systems theory, we talk about the difference between sets and systems. Sets are just not connected bundles of independent things, right? So you have a set of cups, for example.
Right.
Those cups have no relationships. There's no augmentation of the deliverable because those cups are working together, right? But complex systems, they're built around these nodes of expertise tying together. And it's the relationships that make the system greater than the sum of its parts, right? And that's why computers beat us. The first line of the book that I've added since you read it is a line from Kevin Kelly, who's a futurist. And he said, communal intellect is the singularity. The singularity refers to this idea that there's going to be some point in technology where it just goes exponential, where smart computers create smarter computers, and then we can never catch up. Kelly doesn't actually believe in that technological jump. What he says is it's communal knowledge. It's when we learn to put our brains together through language and technology
Mm-hmm.
that will really take off. That's the singularity. That's the point where we'll just explode. And what I'm exploring in this book is the idea that, can we do that in law? Can we create a way that we actually deliver greater expertise and greater service by the connection of these two roles?
Got it. And the expert side of things, we've talked about, but that audience kind of connector is where a lot of people are kind of sitting now, and to your point, kind of half doing the expert. But
Right.
when it comes to everything they're being told, it's you need to be this entrepreneur, you need to listen to consumer, you need to answer the phone more,
Right.
um, you need to provide, like here's how it is means to work with us, here's my differentiator of brand, here's what, like that's all this kind of
Sure.
audience access side of things, but that's not for everybody.
No.
And that's something that I think that's very important. There you talk about, these are extremes on the kind of like threshold here, right? So you've got your expert and you've got your full, I've never bill an hour, I run a law firm
Right.
entrepreneur, right? In there are people who say, I really don't want to be the expert, but I kind of like this area. And I'm cool doing 20, 30 hours, spending the time with my kids when I want to, coaching the kids when I want to, and jumping in on a freelance site. Like, lawclerk.legal or something, right?
Right.
Like, so it's not like you have to be one of these things. But these are the two extremes that when you can thread those other pieces together, you can provide amazing value. And to your point, maybe even solve some of the access issues, because this solution gets created in a way that people understand it. It maybe is more affordable and more margin for all the attorneys involved.
Right. Yeah. No, I advocate for those two poles just because they're the most irreplaceable, right? It's, if you have an audience, it's really hard for somebody else to come and take that from you, as long as you're treating them well. That's an independent source of value. It's an asset, right? Again, we're trying to get out of the churn. The churn is very cash flow driven. It's the
Right.
next dollar, it's the next case. An audience has tremendous permanent value, right? And the services, because again, you're a solutions engine, the solutions that you create that you can pass on in value, that just huge value because it's irreplaceable. Similarly, that expertise, doing that nerdy, super hard work that nobody else wants to do, that just makes you irreplaceable. You're the one cow guy. And what's exciting about this economy that we're in now is that it's easier to be either of these kind of people than it has ever been before. You can really be the cow expert in Goliad, Texas, and connect to a global market where your expertise can provide value. It's never been that way before. And for the audience building solopreneur, we have more tools that make it easier to broadcast and to build those relationships of trust than we've ever had before. I really feel like, and I talk about this Star Trek analogy throughout the book, we're in this economy of connection and of abundance, and lawyers just have to decide to be part of it.
So I want to dive into that kind of audience and connection here. Can you stay with me for a little bit? We have to cut off the Facebook Live. We're kind of running out of time here.
Yep.
But stay tuned. We will be back with Mike Whelan, and you can catch him the full interview when we post it live, post our lives on Friday in the archive. But thanks for joining us here on Facebook Live. And if you want more, come check out the archive. But before I go, I want to make sure I say November 14th, right, Mike? That's
November 14th. Yeah. If you go to lawyerforward.com right now, you can get the book for pre-order on Kindle. The book will release on November 14th, and the physical copy will be available at that time. And it's all at lawyerforward.com.
Awesome. So check it out. Yeah, I saw it's on Amazon there as well, in the Kindle. So lawyerforward.com, and look for the book. It was great read. These things we talked about here explained in much more detail with really good analogies and pulling in from a lot of other books that I jotted down that I now need to read. So thanks a lot, Mike. And everybody, we'll see you next time. Okay. So I do want to continue on that audience.
All right, now we can
thing.
get to the secret sauce. All right, here's how you make millions, everybody.
Here's all the stuff you missed. If you just watched the Facebook Live, oh well.
Only fools.
If you took the time to come here,
yeah,
you're going to get the good stuff now. So the solution stuff, this was like, to me, like the big leap where for an audience kind of entrepreneur minded, right? This is the, I see taxis suck and I see a whole bunch of people who drive cars. Why can't I connect people via an app, right? Like that's a solution mind, right? Somebody stepped back and said, that's a problem that can be solved with all the tools that are available. Nothing fancy, right? Like GPS was already existed. And I think you talked about some of this in your book, right?
Yeah. You can stack solutions that already exist. It's that habit that you're trying to develop is not so much, I'm not on the lawyer should learn to code side. I'm not one of those people. But if you learn to think in those complex systems that deliver value, that's really what Uber is, right? It's just a stacking of existing solutions to solve a problem inside a system.
Right. So any tips for lawyers to kind of like start thinking, or some examples maybe that people are already starting to do?
Sure. Well, part of the issue is the first thing that you have to do is collect an audience, right? So my son was talking to me the other day about he wants to start a business shoveling snow or whatever. And I said, very cool. Now you got to think through what those people are after. What is it that they want to get out of this thing? And he says, well, they want to get out of their driveway in the morning without thinking about it. And I said, okay, well, what's a way that you can serve them that's a little different than shoveling snow? What can you add in terms of value around that will make them feel like they got a good? And he came up with the idea of salting the night before, right? So, and then guaranteeing that if there's any snow on your driveway, I'll come back tomorrow and I'll shovel that snow off, right? So he got to the core of what the user actually wanted and then thought outside the box with a different way to solve that problem. And so he's like buying supplies right now for putting covers on top of cars and laying out salt. And so he's getting ahead of the problem, right? The point is that, and I would refer to my friend Kat Moon, who's very, very good at these things. Design thinking as an idea starts with what is it the user is actually after, right? So you figure out what it is that your people are after. Again, step one is, this is assuming you have people, right? And Brian Clark talks about your minimum viable audience, whatever size that is. You go and you gather through broadcasting your thoughts and your opinions. You put it out to the world, however you do that. You attract this audience and you say to them, what is it you're after? You're the audience I was trying to talk to. You're single moms who have kids with disabilities, for example. What is it that you have? What's your bleeding neck problem? What's the issue that I can solve that would be of the most value to you? And then you go through the exercise of designing a solution. And there's a whole process to that. But the point is, at the end, you're going to have a solution that will solve that problem. And then as a business owner, you have to say, okay, how can I deliver this profitably, right? Just because you can solve the problem doesn't mean that you have to. There's no moral imperative. This thing drives me nuts that people say. There's no moral imperative for you to deliver the solution at a loss, right? But if you can figure out a viable solution that also delivers for the client what they actually are after, what your audience is actually after, then you turn that into a package solution and you do it again and again. Once the goal is, the book talks about this. This is the idea of marginal cost, that you take the time up front to create the solution, and it's a pain in the butt, right? It's a whole process. It's really difficult. Nobody else is willing to do this work. But at the end, what you have is something of value that once it's done the 500th time, it really starts to bring in the money. That's, fundamental to entrepreneurship is risk. The risk is in taking the time up front to do the work to find a solution, because in the end, it's going to be worth a whole lot of money, including if you decide to sell it, right?
Right. And in your mind, in some of that, it's not just the solution, but the solution is a connectedness of other experts. And so that was like kind of going back to those two sides. So, but it's really stepping back and saying, not just do I need to create these templates or some software or technology, but who else do we have access to provide, the solution that my specific audience that believes that I'm the place to go find this,
right,
can do. So the expert doesn't have to go out and say, here's this unique audience, to your cow expert, example. So if I'm, my audience is, like single women having adopting custody issues or something like that, right?
right.
Is there some need, for, well, when I have all these cows and there's some situation and I have this, like this big inheritance coming because it's a property and like that should be valued. There's now an answer for that, and they can go leverage this expert by providing that. And then what you're saying is, if there's 500 people who have that problem that you can identify, then you could build it into a package and then sell it something that's profitable, and not have to just do a billable hour thing every time.
Yeah, and those things, finding those solutions creates permanent value. One of the things that's crucial to entrepreneurship, one of the things that's true of actual entrepreneurs, the method of the entrepreneur, is that they're building to sell, right? So it's asset driven. I recently finished an engagement. I was with Casetext, the legal research company, for 6 months, and that project ended and I left. And when I was leaving, smart companies do this. They gave me a document that says, okay, as you leave, here's what you can't take with you, right? This stuff is owned by the company. And it was processes, it was inventions, it was techniques, it was, processes, products. You can't take that stuff with you, but you can go, right? They couldn't keep me in that place. What's really interesting about, and I've been talking to a young up and coming attorney about this. If you go buy a law firm, most of them don't have all this stuff that Casetext identified as the stuff of value that remains with the company, and the person is leaving, right?
Right.
So you've actually got both sources of value, both the human capital that is me leaving, and all these assets that you haven't developed and that they don't have value. Obviously, if you've built a law firm, it has some value. You have some social capital, you have some intellectual capital, even if you haven't put it down, and you have to have some process for transferring it. Law firms are worth something, but they're not worth nearly what we think they are if you don't do that work of building to sell, which is very product focused. It's very process focused. Again, think of the things on that
Right.
list when you leave a company. What stays with the company?
Yeah, that's actually one thing that's always bugged me about a lot of the states that require the named partner, in the brand name, right? It's like you're
Right.
basically creating this problem of not being able to sell, and you're starting to see at large law firms this change to just picking one name that is brandable, and people almost don't even realize it's associated with any kind of person at the firm, right? Because we're realizing that uh, these importance of the equity of the brand is as important, if not more important, than the individual people working in the law firm.
Yeah, well, and you know, Texas has this thing where you can only sell unexpired leases and equipment. So you can have my fax machine and my office, but you can't have anything else. And of course, in Texas, people do sell their firms. There is some transfer of value. Usually, what they do is a staged buyout, right? Like the
Hmm.
other lawyer stays with the company for 3 years, and it's a joint, that's a silent partner or whatever, and they're just paid a salary as a background partner, right? As of counsel, and they pay them more than they're actually worth for that period of time to purchase out this value. Again, there's some value in those things, but if you're an entrepreneur, if you're one of the things that is descriptive of an entrepreneur is that you take risks and that you build to scale for the purpose of selling. These are truths about entrepreneurs, which really doesn't define most law firms. That's just not true of most law firms. So look at the method and figure out how to extract that value, how to create it, and then
Hmm.
how to sell it, right?
Yeah. And then the other thing I think that maybe we're almost taking for granted is in reading this book, like you and I are both in a lot of discussions out there about, the breaking down like the monopoly of law and all these, like where, so you're saying, the future of law, when there is kind of like no monopoly and these things are what going to differentiate you. So if, somebody gets their head around that that's where things are heading, then what's the first thing someone should start thinking about? Like, what's the first step you should take?
Yeah, it's funny. In this, me saying not every lawyer is an entrepreneur, Jack Newton, the CEO of Clio, disagreed with me. And he said the definition of an entrepreneur is somebody who takes risk, and people who go to law school take out $200,000 in student loans and then they go start a business. This is an entrepreneur. What's fascinating is that business model is actually not that risky, right? Creating a highly profitable law firm is actually very doable, right? We have a regulated monopoly, which is not true of most businesses. It is true that it's really hard to figure out how to run a successful law firm, but not because that is difficult. It's just gathering we're not very good at transferring generational knowledge, so we don't collect it very well. But everybody I know who knows how to run a law firm is highly profitable. If you're an entrepreneur, you could go create a business and do literally everything right, and it still falls apart. That's not really true for law. What I think is probable, especially if you see the things that are going on in Utah and in Arizona and in California
Hmm.
and in Oregon, I think it's highly probable that we'll end up without that regulated monopoly, that the definition of lawyering is going to really be restricted to the point that maybe all there is surgeon level lawyer, right? PhD level lawyer experts. And then there's going to be these service providers. And
Which
so,
are entrepreneurs
right,
maybe stepping in
exactly.
and doing that aren't even lawyers, or like
Right,
eccentric consulting or something, like comes in. They're experts at that.
right. And really, if we don't get ahead of it, I just feel like we're going to be pushed out. And I know a lot of solo lawyers. They really did take out a lot of money to try to get into this business, and I personally care very much about what happens to. I know there's this push and pull because it seems a little crazy for us to say, for example, we shouldn't make forms available to consumers because then those consumers won't go hire lawyers, right? I care about the lawyers, but I don't care to the point that I want to restrict consumer choice. If the consumer wants to make that decision, that's up to them. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant of the fact that if you allow paralegals without supervision to go start a legal business, that those lawyers who monetized on paralegals doing legal services, that's how they made money, you've
Mm-hmm.
killed that business, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have just completely gutted the way that business makes money. And if you're going to do that, if we're going to do that as a society, which again, I think is a good thing, then we have to understand that there are costs to that and help these lawyers make the transition into some other alternative, which again is where you get to this distinction. My kind of first step in your thought process is to figure out, do you want a horizontal positioning or do you want a vertical positioning? Do you want to be an expert or do you want to be an audience focused entrepreneur? And the question that I asked a friend of mine, Megan Xavier, to frame this was, would you rather spend your week writing a book or managing people, right? If you want to write a book, if you're that kind of person, which there are many lawyers who are, I am really tired of the narrative that there's no place for you in the future of law. I think that's insane. It will be easier, like I said, to be experts now than ever before. If you want to be that kind of person, you want to write a book, go become an expert, do the method. If you'd rather manage people, right, and you want to be the solutions engine and you just like coming up with ideas and you've got a notebook where you're just looking around at the world, finding solutions left and right, that's what you obsess over, then decide to be the kind of entrepreneur and figure out that method. Those are different books, they're different courses, they're different mindsets, they're different activities, totally different methods. Make the decision first, that's step one, and then figure out the method.
Yeah, I like to look at it as on that second side. It's like, the people that say, I want to go help a lot more people in this particular area. If you're leaning that way of like, I want to, like, impact and feel and touch and see the people that I'm helping at a wider scale, then you need to go create some solutions, right,
Right.
in the future. So,
Well, and here's what worries me, just as an aside. I was at a conference, I was talking to a lawyer, and she said she wanted to be I can't remember if the word hospice, that's what she referred to. She wanted to be the hospice care type lawyer, like really personal. There's another word that lawyers will use for this a lot, where it's like, I'm really personal. I'm right there with you. I really understand you. I love you. We're together all the time. I'll help you with whatever legal problem. The concierge lawyer, that's the word they use.
concierge, yeah.
Um, which is fine in principle, but hospice care workers, midwives, home health nurses, they make $50,000 a year, right? We can look at what the future positions are and still question what the economic value of those positions will be. So for example, I was reading a book that was talking about one day machines will perform surgeries, and it's really nice to say, well, we'll still need the surgeons to program the robots, right? This is something that Richard Susskind says a lot in his books about the future of law is, we will, the machines, the algorithms will do what lawyers do, but we're always going to need lawyers to program the algorithms. The problem is we have no idea what the economic value of that lawyer is, right?
Yeah.
And
And
it
by the
all
way,
depends
that
on,
might be, we need one surgeon to program the robot, not
exactly. And
all the
and
surgeons.
and it depends on how replaceable they are, right? If you can get, again, the availability of substitutes, if you can get some other surgeon in that spot and it doesn't cost you much to transfer that, you're just going to go get, you've got all the economic power then as the company. So the reason I kind of, it worries me, this shift that we're saying to solo attorneys, oh, just move into the gig economy, right? Like move into, be outsourced to, take your place on the legal supply chain and be the laborer. That is a fine spot, like you mentioned before. It is certainly a better lifestyle than the churn. If in a way you're still churning because you're limited by your production, but and it's certainly better than this kind of grind out, make nothing model. Go be with your kids. It's all cool. That's a lifestyle business. If that's what you want to have, that's fine. Just understand, again, a hospice worker is paid $50,000 a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't know when you decide to go down that road that it's going to be worth economically whatever you label it as, because you won't have that, I'm a lawyer and that's what lawyers charge anymore, right? That will go away. If there's no monopoly, our economic value is defined by the availability of substitutes. So do the rare work, build the audience, be an expert, right?
Got it. Well, thank you, because this is things for people to think about, like these extremes, and definitely grab the book. And always great time talking to you about some of the detail. I mean, I had some other questions, but I think you've kind of covered some of these in everything else we were going. Yeah,
Well,
because
and
the Ken
now we
Grady
have to tell them
exercise you
where the
talked
$1
about.
million are, you know, because they came to this secret
The
conversation. We
secret,
got to tell
yeah.
them. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too, because it's like you also talk in the book about you can't go from here to there like in one year else with no money coming in the door, right? So how do you do that? How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah.
With
Fortunately, we are still in the monopoly. And I don't like a cash flow obsessed business. And that's really what the churn practice model is. I talk at the beginning of the book about how this kind of big firm model that then was transferred to small firms, how that came to be. It's very cash flow focused. It's very driven by this next hour in this next case, the engine that keeps you going. That's what produces this churn. It's You do need some cash flow though, right? Like most businesses, the number people get this wrong. The number two killer of businesses is cash flow. They just didn't have enough money to survive. The number one killer is that they were delivering something people didn't actually want, right? It's a
right.
product market fit problem.
Yeah.
But cash flow matters, and you've got to figure out how to do that. What I would suggest for anybody to do, if you're going to be the audience focused entrepreneur, this is pretty simple. Deliver a service that right now you, as a monopolized, regulated monopoly, can deliver. So if you decide that you're going to help single moms with disabled kids, well, right now you could do custody cases, right? And you can use that to monetize. That's fine. Monetize, pay your bills, keep yourself afloat, but start doing that. The four things that I talk about in the book are design, source, build, and deliver. Start doing those things now, because that's the work that will create value in the long run. Same with an expert business. If you decide you want to be the cow lawyer, well, right now there's ranchers who are fighting over what happened to their livestock, right? There
Mm-hmm.
are ways to make money right now, but eventually you're building more of a consulting business. So your monetization is very different. You do that getting to know work so that you can build up the expertise for later. There are ways to pay the bills now as long as the monopoly is in place. And I don't know if that's going to be in place for 5 years or 10 years or 20. I have no idea. But in general, whether the monopoly is gone or not, that lawyer that I told you about at the beginning, the very senior lawyer, he's still benefiting from monopoly, but he's doing it at age 80, churning cases.
Right.
So even if you can continue to do it to cash flow to pay the bills to stay alive, I would encourage you to get out of it as soon as you can, because that fiction won't last. And even if it does, that's not a life you want.
Right. So that's the interesting part, right? So it's not just here's where the future's going, but even if you're doing it, it's not a great life long term.
Right. Yeah, it's not
So
fun. And that guy, I think I might have told you this, and here's the secret sauce story. At the end, that lawyer, while I was drafting the book, after I'd finished the first draft, that lawyer actually committed suicide. He was in Rockport, Texas. The hurricane hit, and he didn't, I didn't put it in the book because it would sound gratuitous. I don't want to pretend that if this guy knew what the legal supply chain was, he'd be alive today. Obviously, that's insane. But he didn't have the emotional reservoir or the financial reservoir to deal with the difficulty that came. And it was really hard. But for me, it threw in relief that at the beginning of the book, I said, I don't want to end up like this. And as I was doing it, that we lost him too soon, right? And so
mhm.
for me, what drives me with this book, and what I would say to anybody who's considering whether they should rethink using these systems thinking principles, whether they should rethink what they assume about the practice of law, the stakes could not be higher, right? We
Mhm.
literally have people dying. And oftentimes, another pet peeve of mine is that people will say, well, I know this successful lawyer and I know that successful lawyer. And or a successful lawyer who's kind of a prick will say to you, well, get over it if you just work harder. Listen, I'm not saying that there are not completely successful lawyers. I am saying we can't justify system problems with statistical anomalies. We can't pull out the people who it's worked really well
Right.
for and say, therefore, let's ignore the costs of the system, right? That mentality kept slavery going. That mentality keeps unjust incarceration going. There are systems costs that if we're only looking at our purchase And our decision, we're ignoring those systems costs. And right now, for our industry, the costs are high. Depression is high. Substance abuse is high. Death tolls, suicide rates are insane. We all know this. So the stakes are high enough to rethink the whole system. And it's good for you too, right? Like what I'm advocating in this book, it's personally good for you. And I hope that you will pick one of those two paths because they are highly profitable and they're highly necessary. But I'm also very driven by the system cost right now, which is just too high.
And then one other thing, and while you're still getting cash flow and looking at these other options, is you also advocate for, don't try to do it all. So like outsourcing, like virtual assistants and outsourcing your bookkeeping and like all these things that you probably shouldn't be doing, and in either of those extremes definitely can't do.
Right.
To do those well.
Yeah, I say at the beginning of the book, and there are some people who disagree with me on this, I think being the quote unquote true solo is a terrible plan, trying to do everything on your own, because some of those skills aren't complementary. Those activities actually conflict with each other. So, again, we go to a conference and they say, you should be available by text all the time. And then in the next session, they say, here's some totally random freaking thing that if you don't know, you're going to be sued and lose your license. I can't answer texts all the time and know that random freaking thing. There's no way for me to do both activities at the same time. And it's creating this pressure on the true solo. And so I mentioned the 4 activities of a legal supply chain manager: design, source, build, and deliver. The second one is sourcing. These are strategic decisions, right? How you decide what your firm is going to keep inside so you can hire people,
Mm-hmm.
right? You might call that a firm, whatever. You might keep some activities in-house, and then what activities you have out of your house, that's a strategic decision. Where are the limits of your service business, for example? If somebody, and I give the example, if a client comes to you and says, hey, move my nuclear waste, you don't have to say yes to that. That's a strategic decision. And how you decide to deliver these additional services, these are all strategic decisions. None of this, the supply chain is, how you piece people together or tools or processes to solve whatever problem it is, whether it's expert issues or solopreneur issues. It's all a connected group. And your job as an owner is to figure out who's going to do what. And again, the net effect to me that I hope that we'll see in this economy is that we'll actually get better at delivering both
Mm-hmm.
high service and high expertise through connection, right? It's only through connecting to each other that we can do both things, because again, they're not complementary skills. So let's put it all together and we can deliver both for people.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to leave it there for this episode. Thanks again for joining me, Mike, and
Absolutely.
appreciate it. So again, if you didn't hear it earlier, lawyerforward.com to grab the book or get information, your blogs up there, all your content, right? So, and then on Twitter, where should people follow you? Because I know you're very active up there.
Yeah, and it's because Twitter is cheaper than a therapist, I found. My Twitter handle is at Mike Whelan Jr. It's WHELANJR. And I apologize in advance if you go there and you try to understand me. There's occasional rants. Sometimes it's about my kids or what I made for dinner last night. I try to avoid all politics. I've muted the word Trump and the word Lakers because those are the 2 words that get me most worked up. So go to Twitter. It's a fun time.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. See you next time.
Hey, what's up? I'm Josh. Thanks so much for joining us. If you feel like you learned something today, think of how beneficial it would be to chat with myself or another one of our marketing consultants one-on-one. Go ahead and visit our website to schedule your free consultation. It only takes a minute.